figured out the setting now. Yeah, this should work. Welcome to the show. Sam, Sparsh,
Thanks for having us.
no, for sure, man. Your project's been intriguing me since the first time we met, rather, and I've been thinking about exactly how I would want to drive this conversation, and I want to touch on technical aspects. I want to touch on historical aspects, but I also want to get this very interesting concoctment that you both sort of bring to the table, right? And I was reading one of those things that was out there yesterday at the fundraiser, and it said that you were across the border. One of you was in Gilgit, the other was in Ladakh, right? And you were in communication somehow.
So we had met 3 years previously when we were at some Diwali dinner at Oxford University. And we befriended each other, decided we were going to be great friends, and basically didn't speak to each other for another 2 years or so. And then, we followed each other on Instagram from 2 years previously. And he saw that I was in the mountains somewhere, and the mountains looked very similar to the mountains he was around. So it was like, hey, you in Ladakh?
Right.
And I was like, no, I'm in, where was I? I was in Kaplu,
Right.
which is just Baltistan, just north of the...
Line of control.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you don't meet like many people who like in their first year like go out and like backpack across the mountains.
Right.
So when I saw this guy was like in the same area, I thought I'd like send him a message like, your photography is really cool. Do you want to meet up at the market? And he's like, actually, I'm in Pakistan.
There's this little bit of a border in
yeah,
between.
a little logistically difficult. But then we started talking over that. So then when we went back to Oxford and like started thinking about like the idea of the project, like I instantly knew who I wanted to reach out to,
Right.
because we'd already had a conversation like that about
Right.
like
And so
how
it was
ridiculous that
was it exactly the cultural similarities across the border that prompted you to think about the partition and go about it, or is that like a story that sort of fits the picture?
You and Amina had been discussing everything before, like your grandparents'
Yeah.
migration just beforehand, and you and Sadia had been talking about it. There's been a lot of conversations.
Yeah, so I mean, I come from a partition family, so I have always seen like my grandfather like scribbling away and like writing Urdu poetry in his diary, and he always talks about his village, and I've like heard these stories since I was a kid from both my maternal and my paternal grandfather, who like came from different parts of West Punjab. And so I was fascinated by the subject. I also I grew up in Australia, where I lived along I had very, very close Pakistani friends, and so over there we never really felt a difference between each other. So whenever I used to come back to India, I would kind of sense it's like listening to the news or hearing people speak, like where does this cultural prejudice come from?
Right.
Why is there this divide? And so when I went to Oxford, and I had a really close Pakistani friend, Amina. Her grandfather migrated the other way. He came from Hoshiarpur to Lahore. We started talking about what's a way that we can take our grandparents back.
Right.
And then the idea of the project developed.
Right.
Now, Sam, I remembered from when we were speaking over Instagram, shared a connection to the same area. Obviously, we'd met at a Diwali dinner, and
Right.
Sam's family has such a connection to India. But through that conversation, I was kind of like, this guy digs travel, which is something that this project is all about fundamentally, and also can understand it was really absurd when we were messaging each other this is the same mountain, we're just looking at it from different sides. So yeah, it's a story that kind of fits the bill, but it's also we weren't explicitly talking about it politically, but there was a kind of recognition that this is just ridiculous.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And so
The photos were all the same, it's the same kind of people. The mosques that I was taking photos of looked like the stupas that he was taking photos of, and the food we were eating was identical, and completely...
Right. I mean, but walk me through it, because this seems it is quite a number of pieces I observed last night on the table as far as Project Dastaan is concerned. It does not really have an elevator pitch. I don't really have an elevator pitch for it. So how would you describe what is it that you're trying to do?
We're trying to take old people back and make stiff uncles cry.
That's a good elevator pitch. That I'm sold. How much money do you want for the donation?
Yeah, we're just trying to use this this technology to bridge an empathy gap. And, you show people that they came from similar places. You show people they went through the same journey.
Right.
And these cultural barriers break down.
Right.
And the other thing is, it's not just the kind of partition survivors themselves, but their grandkids. who've grown up with this kind of vague idea that there's some town, little village somewhere where their ancestry is from, but they've never seen it and they never will see it. Like, it's virtually impossible for anyone to get a visa.
Right.
And so, it's not just for the survivors, but for their families, for the larger community of...
Yeah.
Right. So you basically are, and from what I understand, correct me where I'm wrong, it was like that you interview these people, ask where they live. They used to live rather before partition. You go there, you get your VR equipment there, you get a good 360 view of the village or the town or whatever the locality is, and then you show it to them in order to make them cry. Right. So that
Give them the experience of going
right.
back.
That's fantastic. And how's Oxford University involved with all of this?
So we all studied at Oxford.
What is it that you guys studied?
Like totally different stuff. I studied politics, philosophy, and economics.
I did Sanskrit and Persian.
Yeah.
Saadia did South Asian studies. Amina studied chemistry.
Right.
So that's the original 4, and then, but it's grown, and now most people working with us weren't at Oxford, but that was the original core team came from Oxford.
And is there a how would you say, is there a foundation that Oxford University is providing you with all of this? Are they giving you access, reach, resource, any of that?
Yeah, so there's a couple avenues of support. So we have like certain professors at different departments who kind of mentor us and
Right.
Take us through the process, especially as we started off quite early, like all of us from very different fields.
Mm-hmm.
None of us having studied history in particular. There was like a need to like reach out to some of the history professors,
Right.
talk about the viability of a project
Right.
like this.
Right.
And then later on, we've developed like a closer relationship with the area studies department, who are kind of affiliated with us and kind of...
Right. And there was a lot of conversation the first time we met about, at least Sam, you and I, when you spoke a lot about how there is an urgent need to place the partition in the history of Southeast Asia as a whole. It was as if that it wasn't discussed enough, or at least in as much vibrancy.
Yeah, so until quite recently, just like several other great tragedies in history, that people did not really open up about partition, and in particular in the UK South Asian community, most of whom arrived in the UK as a result of the partition. It was quite recent. It was in the last 5 years that kind of loads of families began opening up about their family histories, and there were several BBC documentaries, and suddenly people started ringing in. Suddenly there was this huge movement of kind of opening up about what the trauma. But this is the defining moment in modern South Asian identity. You can't understand the political identity, the social identity, the kind of religious identities of any of the 3 countries, India, Pakistan or Bangladesh, without understanding partition. And yet it's kind of briefly mentioned in the vein of politics. People learn about Jinnah and Gandhi and Nehru, but they don't necessarily learn just the individual stories. And this kind of oral history way of approaching it has not been taken to its full potential at all. And there's basically a couple of years left. These people are all in their 90s now.
Right.
And if we don't interview them now, within the next 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, they'll either be too old or too young to remember anything.
Yeah, and we're working with like a bunch of people who are working they're working towards the same cause. There's some fantastic research going on, and we're one of many projects that seek to highlight this kind of bottom-up view of world history, as opposed to let's look at it through the major political actors. So you've got, you met Anchal last night. You've got people like Yasmin Khan. You have the Citizens Archives both in Pakistan and India, and of course there's the 1947 Partition Archive, which has recorded thousands of stories. And we're working alongside these people to mentor us on our journey.
Right.
And one of the pillars of our project is we are trying to use this new technology not just to take people back to their old homes, but because in an educational setting, it's far more engaging for students. And that's something that like immersive media, when applied to this section, or like not just the partition, but applied to teaching people about heritage and history in general, shows a lot of potential for increased engagement, because they can actually see the places that they're talking about rather than just read about it in a book or even watch it in a film. It's truly immersive, and it does add an extra layer for kids who otherwise wouldn't be interested at all in the subject matter to get involved and to learn a bit more about their culture.
To get over the stereotypes that people would associate with the kind of places across the border.
Yeah.
Right.
It's literally trying to put yourself in the shoes of someone from the other side.
And Project Dastaan has a peculiar predicament in the sense that there is only so many years that, you know, these stories will still be alive enough to be recorded, put into picture, put into video, and also that you have an educational, or you have a desire to place the colonial history, this split of identity, the formation, the creation of the new Southeast Asia into the educational curriculum, sort of into the embedded within the education systems where it is not discussed, right? You mentioned something about that being the case in England.
Yeah, so I didn't study in England. From what I know of the English educational curriculum regarding like that period of history in South Asia, like post-colonialism and the end of empire, it's very much focused on Britain's involvement in World War II is what's spoken about that era. You have discussion of the East India Company and the rise of the East India Company. You have extensive discussion and glorification of Churchill, which Sam has written about. But the partition itself and the loss that not just South Asia but the world faced as a result of the tragedy is not something that's adequately spoken about.
Right.
As opposed to something like, and this comparison is often criticized, but and what we believe on the project is as opposed to like a world event on the scale of something like the Holocaust.
It's the fundamental defining point which you cannot get away from when talking about, you know, this people. So like if you're talking about modern Jewish identity, it will be wrapped up in what happened during the Holocaust. You can't get away from that.
Right.
Just in the same way you can't talk about anything in relation to South Asia without really understanding, you know, this fundamental divide that occurred.
Right.
Division.
And I mean, I was more surprised because I grew up in an insulated environment where this was spoken about, right? I learned about this in school. I understand to whatever little degree, right? From a first person point of view, which usually isn't enough trying to understand situations like this. And first person as in like this community is the one that was affected, not me personally, but I grew up learning about it. I didn't know that this wasn't, say, as much of a concept around the world. Like people had no idea, and then therefore no concept of modern Southeast Asia for the same reason.
In Britain at least, generally education on the empire as a whole is still very taboo. And you know, like the people don't speak about it, and whenever anyone suggests it, they're always kind of like, oh, you know, we teach enough, and World War II is more recent, and so we should teach them about what that, and the Cold War is the other one that everyone learns about, which is good, but you know, that Britain's relationship to the world is fundamentally inseparable, and people really from the UK don't know. In the US, people just don't really learn about that region of the world very much, at all. Unless you've got South Asian friends, you won't. It's not a huge part of the education curriculum there. And within India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, there are very sort of specific state narratives, which are completely like polarizing and will give very particular views of what happened. Without, you know, in India, Jinnah features a lot less than Gandhi and Nehru. In Pakistan, Jinnah is the great hero, and Gandhi and Nehru are virtually like non-existent. All these kind of things. I'm not quite sure how Bangladesh treats the different characters.
Bangladesh, and Anam Zakaria writes about this in Al Jazeera, which is a fantastic article, which definitely link like listeners to later. But she writes a lot about how Bangladesh has sidelined the events of 1947 in comparison to 1971, which of course became the national narrative. And this is why we think it's really important to start from bottom up and complement that with also top-down research of history, because top-down analysis of political history can very easily be molded into state narratives in as we see in the curriculums of these three countries. It's much harder to take a look at, like, you know, just an everyday person who suffered through that crisis and try and twist their narrative in a particular way. That requires a degree of politicization which people can see through. They can see when you're trying to shift someone's personal testimony
Right.
to fit the narrative,
Right.
as opposed to emphasizing, exaggerating, or diminishing the relative importance of well-known political characters.
So, I mean, this was one of the questions I was thinking about yesterday as well, because it seems like you guys have uncovered far more than I have about the partition, and I am curious, and I'm sure anybody who's listening to it is curious if the state narrative isn't sufficient, isn't objective enough. How do we begin placing the partition in, say, the historical context of Southeast Asia? What is
I think more regional focus, more diversity in stories, I think is a good place to start. So because of the simple pragmatic fact that women were much more affected by partition in terms of, there was a lot of rape, a lot of killing, a lot of forced abduction. Women began to be linked to kind of the pride of different communities, and there was a lot of awful stuff that happened. They were disproportionately affected, and yet because of kind of social stigma, far fewer women have actually spoken about their experiences publicly. And so a lot more information publicly is from the kind of male perspective. Similarly, most narratives that you hear at least India and Pakistan, are very Punjab centric, which was where most of the kind of violence of partition took place. But you hear a lot less about Bengal, firstly, but then also Hyderabad, also Tripura was a huge centre of migration, which very few people talk about at all. Meghalaya, Sindh.
How's about in Tripura? What is the partition that happened in Tripura? Tell me about it.
Tripura is essentially kind of, the Hindu, a Hindu area east of East Bengal, right? And there was a huge number of Hindus from East Bengal who migrated over there. And so, they were flooded with Bengali refugees in a huge way. And that narrative is never spoken about.
Yeah, I've never really heard of it except from you. And how is it different from, say, the narrative of somebody in Punjab? So that I have a clearer picture of that.
It's less that it's different, but there were different political players, and there were different. So to give you a sense of like the difference, east and west, on the Punjab border, there was a lot more violence, but there was also a lot. It also happened a lot more suddenly. Right? So everyone migrated within like that year. Within 1947, basically the entire migration had taken place. Whereas the Bengal migration was a lot less violence and a lot slower. There were instances of huge violence, but these were much more sporadic. Whereas the whole of the Punjab just went to chaos. And also, the migration in Bengal has been a lot more. It's not really stopped. Unlike the Punjab one, where, because of the fact that basically East Punjab has very few Muslims today, with the exception of like Sirhind and Malerkotla.
Right.
And similarly, like, West Punjab, there's very few Hindus left there, Sikhs left there.
Right. So there is some air bubbles of demographics that got stuck roughly across the border in both ways.
Yeah, but it's also how this continued migration as opposed to a kind of, this
Instant.
being a memory. Like in Punjab today, it's the memory of migration, whereas for Bengal and the whole of, and Meghalaya and Tripura, this is a continued fact of life. People are, and we can see this with
the CA and
the
RC
CA
debate.
and,
NRC, right.
as in, this is a continued political issue in the way that in Punjab, everyone's like, we can remember these guys, but there are none left.
Yeah.
So what are places did you end up traveling doing all of this shit? Like, I'm sure you guys...
Makodi, Pambla.
I mean,
You went
like,
deep Punjab, huh?
we went deep
It never lets you go. Once you're there, it never lets you go,
we were
man.
in this town. We were tracing a story of these two cousins, Iqbal and Badar, who now live in London but migrated from near Roopnagar in Punjab to Lahore. And so we called them up, and we're trying to figure out like exactly where. The town's obviously expanded since. So they're like, okay, no, we came from a village. Not them, but their wives came from a village called Makodi. So we look around and we ask the locals, like, where can we find this place, Makodi? And we get pointed to a town. We turn up there, and
This is in Punjab, right?
This is in Punjab.
Okay.
Just on the border of Himachal, kind of north.
Oh, okay.
Near Naligarh.
Nalagarh, Chandigarh.
Okay, right.
North
Chandigarh.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yep.
So we're at this corner shop, And we're like, are we in Makodi? And he says, do you mean Badi Makodi or Choti Makodi? And we're like, actually, we have no clue. So we give Iqbal a call again. It's like, was your wife from Badi Makodi or Choti Makodi? And he says, I don't remember which one he said. He said, one of them. He said, my wife's from Badi Makodi.
Right.
And so we asked the guy, is this Choti Makodi or Badi Makodi? He says, this is Choti Makodi, but it used to be Badi Makodi 70 years ago. Obviously, the relative size of the towns have changed. But what hasn't changed is one was Uparwali Makodi and one was Nichewali Makodi. So we figured out which one they were, recorded it. But, the kinds of places we film are like, you'll never hear of.
What's the strangest place you went to? What's the strangest fucking experience you had?
Well, there's a few places we go and it's quite sad because there's just absolutely nothing left. The construction site's taken up the entire village.
There's very little heritage, particularly in Punjab, which is preserved by the ASI, etc.
Right.
So you have all of these mosques, which we've spotted in so many villages. These old crumbly mosques that were falling apart. Just in the same way that in Pakistan, you always find these little gurudwaras that were abandoned, and they might be being looked after, but they're kind of very. But yeah, these used to have kacha houses, right?
Right.
These were like mud brick, thatched roofs, that kind of stuff. And so, one time we went back, I think it was to...
Mesatibba was
No, Chakkarma was the one with there was a well, and we were showing...
No, that was Mesatibba.
That was Mesatibba.
That was Mesatibba.
And then there was the old tree, and we got a whole tour of it, of all the places that might still ring a bell, which is sweet.
Yeah.
So you traveled across borders then. You went to Pakistan, you've been to
Sam's
India.
been to Pakistan.
Oh, you've been.
Yeah.
Are you not allowed?
I'm still applying for my visa.
Ah, okay.
Let's see. Fingers
I
crossed.
hear
If
you.
you're listening, Imran Khan, fingers crossed.
No, we'll tweet at him. We'll take the clip out, tweet at him. Imran, give my bro a visa. So, and have you guys been to Bangladesh yet? Has that been covered by?
We've been to West Bengal.
Uh-huh.
We are still setting up a team in Bangladesh because one of the key things is that we need to be able to show up and kind of speak in all the local dialects. We want to do all of our interviews in the local dialects, not even in Hindi Urdu, but like in Punjabi, Bengali.
Oh, so you learn the
Kashmiri.
language.
We'll find someone who can. So we'll have a translator in each area and a person, a kind of fixer. Essentially.
Right. And how's it? I'm sorry, this is a tangent. But how's it that you got interested in Sanskrit and Persian, and why the two? Speaking of languages,
it's the same kind of reason why I'm doing Dastaan, which was that when I just after I finished school, I had a year out and I was planning to do physics.
theoretical or experimental?
It was theoretical. It was kind of like philosophy and physics.
Yep. I get that.
And then I went traveling around India and Pakistan for a couple of months, and worked in a bookshop, raised some money, went traveling, and had the best time, and just got very amazed by all these. Began learning a bit of Farsi in Delhi, and then began to see how everything was falling apart, and wanted to basically be able to speak intelligently about this whole conflict, because as in being the white guy in the city, I wanted a reason to actually be able to say, I can I do know this, I have like a qualification, and so I think, and also I grew up on the stories of the Mahabharata,
Right.
Like the Amritsar Kata, comic books,
Right.
and living in Delhi, you constantly hear Ghalib's poetry and stuff like that. So I'd always been interested in all that kind of stuff. So it just kind of happened. And my degree changed over the course of, when I arrived, it was going to be more philosophy of, Indian philosophy. Whereas then what I actually got more into once I arrived at Oxford was the language aspect.
Right. Very interesting. So how fluent are you in Sanskrit?
Sanskrit, I can read. They didn't do any kind of spoken Sanskrit at Oxford. It was very much an academic. We will teach you to read the Meghaduta, Kalidasa's stuff. We'll teach you to read the Arthashastra, the Kama Sutra, the Rig Veda, all of these ancient texts. But I was never doing chanting. Okay. So you guys with Project Dastaan are set out to cover. I believe 75 stories overall. You want 75 stories for the project, right? Before the 75th anniversary of partition.
Before the 75th anniversary.
So the idea is 2022 is our kind of self-imposed deadline, where if we get more money, then sure, we'd love to continue doing this.
Right.
But our aim is that before 2022, we wanted to have covered 75 stories and taken 75 families home.
Right. And how much through are you with this?
We've taken around 8 families back so far. And
8 families.
interviewed around 25 migrants.
Right.
Yeah.
And these have been emotional experiences.
Yeah, incredibly emotional experiences.
For you as well?
Yeah.
Has there been places where you've just been like, why the hell am I even doing this?
Yeah, no, definitely. This is something that I just did not expect. I think no one on the team expected before we joined this project, but like hearing these stories repeatedly does take a toll. And when you hear about stories of like mass riots day in, day out, and it's the only thing you hear, you start imagining things like these as well.
Right.
Start speaking to
So your
people
dreams
about
must be an interesting place right now. It's like a Rick and Morty episode in his dreams.
But you learn to separate. I think like eventually you learn to separate, your personal life from. You can't just be thinking about this all the time. And
right.
I mean, the fellowship we received through that, I've had like the exposure of like spending a lot of time with like journalists who've covered a lot of conflict, and this is something I spoke to them about. And you develop a degree of desensitization to this kind of violence and trauma. As for the positives, there's plenty. We reconnect old friends, and you see them breaking down because they're so happy to speak to these people again.
Right.
We've made two old friends manage to reconnect. So in Makodi, that we were asking, so that we came to this village with one photograph that Iqbal had been sent by his friend. No, Ahmed had been sent by his friend Narendra Singh. And so we kind of went around. We found the mosque, and then there was this guy in the picture who was supposedly his best friend. He was a Sikh man his best friend was the Muslim guy who went off to Pakistan. And we were like, does anyone know this man Narendra Singh? And eventually we managed to find that he'd unfortunately passed away a few years previously, but that his wife was still living in Chandigarh. And so we then drove off to Chandigarh. We managed to find her, track her down, put her on the phone to Iqbal for the first time in 72 years. And in the same way, we then went to Lucknow with Saida.
So we went to Karachi. And she was like, this is one of the earliest stories we did, and she's also kind of like, Saida Siddiqui is like, she speaks so beautifully, she's become the face of like our project in terms of this elderly lady, elderly Pakistani lady who just...
The one who reaches out for the camera in the promo video? Yeah.
That's her.
That's very cute.
So I'll explain to you.
When we were in Lucknow tracing a story, she used to talk about this, like, she said, I lived next to a mandir and there was a pandit. And we went to her apartments, they'd been raised down. Yeah, no, people tree.
People tree.
Yeah, they'd been raised down, but there was the mandir there. So we went in, and like a bunch of kids approached us and their parents, and they're like, why are you here? We're like, okay, across the road from here, there used to be a family called the Hanif family. That was her maiden name before she got married. Do you know anything about them? And this man says, no, I haven't heard anything. You guys are in the wrong place, because I knew the people who lived here before them, and they were my family friends. There's no Hanif family. And then, like, you hear a voice from the back of the mandir, and he's like, wait, did someone say Hanif family? This old man walks out, and he's like, no, you don't know. Before the partition, before you were born, there was a family here called the Hanif family. So we showed him a video of Saida, we showed him any pictures that we had, and he's like, yes, I remember this. I remember this girl, because she was a girl at the time that, they'd left, and he was the pandit's son. Who still ran the temple now. So we put them on the phone with each other.
Right.
And they used to offer each other sweets at religious festivals, and occasionally play together in the park.
Right.
Yeah.
You guys went out chasing your Bollywood dream, man. This is exactly like Bachna and Hasino, but for partition. Have you guys seen that film?
No,
Okay.
I've heard the song. I've heard the
I
song.
hope the people who listen to it, like the people who get the context, is a funny joke, but I think this does not land properly. So what is next for you guys when you go about doing this? I'm sure there is you have a roadmap for 2020, since 2022 is where checkmate happens, sort of, for you guys. What do you do next now that you've been traumatized 8 times? How do you get to the other 67?
Well, so we got 67 to go.
Well, yeah, it was the crowdfunder this month. So
Right, yeah. So tell me about it. How are you trying to raise money? What is the end for that?
So we began to realize that a lot of foundations, as in it's too wrapped up in the political identities for sort of large pots of money to get involved, but so many individuals want to help out. And everyone's individual families have been affected by this thing. And so we decided to do a crowdfunder. We're trying to raise $20,000 US dollars in a month online. Just, you can find our Kickstarter page, and it's an all or nothing model. So if we don't quite hit 20k, then we don't get any of it. But if we do, then that basically funds the rest of the
project.
The rest of the take backs. And so we launched that yesterday.
Right.
And we've already made, in just 24 hours, to give you the sense of people, the positive response towards this project. In 24 hours, I think we raised $3,800.
Something close to $4,000. I'm gonna check it right after this podcast.
Just
compulsively refreshing.
I can see Sparsh having a touching moment in his head. Like every time he thinks about it, he's like, yes, $200 more. Yes.
We're like high-fiving each other every £5 that comes in.
And where is it that people can find your link for donation if they have to?
So as in projectdastaan.org, there's a big button in the top right corner that says donate.
Okay. I guess people won't miss that, and I'll put that in the show notes as well for people to find.
Yeah.
And have you tried reaching out to I don't know, the culture ministry in India, or for that matter in Pakistan? Have you tried tweeting to these guys, asking them if they'd be interested in something like this? Because it seems like it works well along the same sentiment that the corridor in Kartarpur corridor was opened, like this mutual... Because India and Pakistan are weird like that, right? Where the institutions are not the best friends with each other, but all of us sort of understand that there is civilians are fine with each other, that... It isn't a war that involves civilians. It's more of a war that involves the politics of societies, right? And I'm pretty sure if you, or at least I'm guessing, that if you guys hit up some of these guys, you might get a response. Have you walked down that road yet?
We have currently tried to raise funding from non-governmental sources, or if they are governmental sources, from sources outside of the subcontinent. And this is not to take a political view. This is just so that we can't be accused of taking a side. And as such, that if we did get a donation from, let's say, the Ministry of Cultural Affairs in India, I know the team wouldn't feel comfortable using that money until we had equally backing source
from Pakistan.
As well.
I mean, are you putting out anything that is charged at all? Like, I really don't think taking sides would be an issue.
That's something that we've been quite keen to kind of keep. Because as long as we keep our focus at just like we want to take back old people to their homes,
right? And so I'm curious how the angle for the ministry being a side taking sort of,
because it's an inherently
pro peace.
No, not like pro peace is one thing, but I think that the subject is inherently political. And while we're taking a non-political angle on it, like if you read through the comments on our Instagram page, even like the latest video that we've released, like there's already people comparing us like to the ISI and saying you guys are pro-Pakistani.
We got compared to the Illuminati.
Yeah, there's like stuff
Oxford
like this.
And Mohsin Hamid is a Muslim, and like
right. So it's sort of like the societal political charge is coming onto you in some sense.
You get that backlash. No, I'm not. Overwhelmingly, the response has been positive. But you
get one stray bhakt once in a while.
Yeah.
Or like one anti-peace.
But we also do try to as in lots of people's issues with us, we do try to take on board. So for example, we are trying to focus on areas that people feel quite strongly about, like Zaren's thing with the Kashmiri Pundits, and which that's an important story that needs to be told. Just like every other part of South Asia, diversity is our key thing.
Right.
If we can cover like as much variety of stories as possible.
And I mean, as soon as you get into the Kashmiri angle of so I'm sure Punjab, massively politicized, split right in the heart of it, has its problems, but as soon as you get into Kashmir, it's a whole different level of being entrenched in politics and international affairs.
And even trying to film at the moment.
And
yes. Oh my gosh.
You take any, like if we come in with an angle saying, look, we're not trying to take a side, we're just trying to highlight the stories of people who might have been marginalized by this state narrative. Like most people will say, that's great, that's fine, we encourage it. And you always get a bunch of people whose entire ethos, and it doesn't matter which side they come from, their entire political ethos is, you're not on my side until you deny the very right of the other side to exist. And that's when we're going to get in trouble. So people who call us out for being ISI agents, just because we acknowledge that some people in the subcontinent do believe themselves to be Pakistani, you know, and like that's just a fact, right? It's not. There's no. That's not under contention.
Right.
They consider themselves Pakistani. They don't consider themselves lapsed Indian Muslims.
Right.
Right. But just by that's got nothing to do with like, that's not a take on who's right in this debate.
Right.
That's just, I'm just talking about like identity. But just by admitting that, I'll get backlash for that. You know, and so that's the kind of thing we're trying to avoid with these like
governmental
governmental institutions.
How's about like explicitly non-governmental organizations who are so?
There's an organization in San Francisco called Catchlight, and they've given us a $30,000 grant in April last year,
right?
To see through actually not so much the virtual takebacks, but to create a virtual reality documentary at the end of these virtual takebacks that contextualizes the story for audiences that don't necessarily have a connection to the subcontinent.
For education, basically.
Yeah.
So you basically sit down after all this is done and then you make it into one huge film of people reaching out to cameras and telling you about shit that they've never spoken about.
That sounds like...
Yeah.
Oh yes, so that you can make
we're
everybody
crying, the
else
aunties
cry.
are crying, the next step is to make the world cry.
Yeah, you guys are taking it on, huh? How is the reaction with because I mean, you know, living in India, growing up in India, the common conception of a non-resident Indian's pretty much painted with the same brush, right? It's the same kind of people, especially Americans, Indians who went to America. And once I did go there, I realized that there is the importance of narrative sort of seemed to emerge, because I thought everybody's narrative about India was the same until I started hearing all my other friends who live there, and I understood how is it that the non-resident population perceives the whole thing.
There's like in general, there's like two responses, and this is me speaking as an OCI,
right?
And as an NRI. I grew up in between America, Australia, and the UK. So I've seen like the Desi community in all three of these countries. There's two responses that you get. You get like a very cosmopolitan, I grew up with Pakistanis and Bangladeshis, why is this happening to me and my family, like fully on board, I support you. And then you have the communities that, because they're actually a minority in these countries now, they've tried to like preserve like the values and traditions of the time that they left the places they were from.
You're insular.
It becomes insular, and it's intended culturally, but it becomes moralistic, and so we sometimes get backlash from these communities, in the same way that you get backlash from like more I wouldn't say conservative, or like more I don't know the terminology for it, but like back home we get backlash, and it's the same reason for people who preserve that insularity overseas. And
do you get people, because I mean no Indian, I hope, is foolish enough, or I'd say stupid enough in the sense of the word courageous and an extrapolation of courageous, to demand or to think of like an Akhand Bharat, which I don't know if you've heard, it gets floated around quite often now in the news. Is there some people who are nostalgic enough for pre-partition India that sort of, you know, escaped back then or even after during the riots or something like that?
I think at this stage it's more seen as like, that would be ideal, but we're never going to get that.
Of course, right.
Like, and it's interesting because one of the biggest inspirations for me, like well before like starting this project, but like, you know, getting me thinking about these ideas, was this book by Anna Funder called Stasiland, where she talks about like the nostalgia of East Germans, especially people involved with the Stasi after the fall of the Berlin Wall,
right?
And how that like there was nostalgia for people, like we want it to be East Germany again, and there was like, you know, the idea of the way nostalgia plays out in like politically, like situations of political conflict, and I see the same situation repeating here. You have the people that like, you know what, like Pakistan should not exist, and these guys are actually just Indians who've been forcibly converted to Islam. And also like on the other side, like you've been to Pakistan, there's this like total denial of like Hindu origin, Hindu identity there.
As in, so I'm always amazed by throughout Pakistan how some of my very well educated friends will not know the difference between like Christian or Shiva, and it's taken kind of 2 generations for that to just lapse. And that, you know, they do very much register their Buddhist origins, notably, but because of partition, they are very keen to kind of and at the moment when I was last there, they were. It's sort of changed in the last 5 years that they've gone from sort of not really understanding who or what Sikhs were, and they kind of had this idea that they did used to live here, but the younger generation really had never interacted with any. To suddenly being incredibly proud of their Sikh community because of this whole Kartarpur thing.
Right.
And there's been a shift I've noticed in 5 years of that. But if we can see that with and it's somewhat like fetishized version, but it's a positive step nonetheless.
Right, and I mean, no value judgment on anybody. I think the force of insulation in India, or for that matter in Pakistan, for the narrative is so strong that it's very difficult to reach out and actually see what is outside. You're so entrenched in the narrative here. But there is also another part that I've always sort of despised about cosmopolitan Indian people, roughly my age, and I'm sure that sort of translates to Pakistan. In my experience, it does. And again, it's no value judgment, but I've seen that there is this sort of a what I like to call a post-colonial trauma, right? Where there is this subconscious desire to approximate it's like a Stockholm syndrome of a very weird nature, where English is a status symbol and looking fair is a status symbol and all that jazz sort of happens. Did you observe I'm sure you observed that in villages and whatnot, where people would crowd around you just because you had a camera and you're white and whatnot. Did that happen often enough? Is that your experience growing up in Delhi?
Delhi, it doesn't happen to me that much. It happens to me kind of sporadically. I think the weirdest moment in my entire life in South Asia was my first trip to Pakistan. I went to Multan, and there was like a crowd of 50 people because they just don't get tourists there.
Right.
Like India, generally, people have in most places have no white people now. Like, isn't it? India's got enough foreign travelers and the hippies who go between
right.
gap years around.
There's more Israelis in India.
Businessmen and all that. Whereas in Pakistan, I was very much an odd one out in Multan. And there were guys who were asking for my autograph, and I was just like, what the fuck?
Do I even know how to make a signature yet?
I don't have a signature.
Right.
And I think it was something about once it reached that critical mass of people crowding around me, others began to crowd around just because they thought that obviously therefore I was...
there has to be something to it.
There has to be...
This is like one of the weirdest tendencies in traffic in India too. As soon as there is any sort of a car collision, everybody's going to stop and see how that might have happened. Everybody's going to speculate, right? So if you're driving down the road and there's a collision up, people are going to make it into a chicken neck. It's going to slow down on its own. I'm like, oh my gosh, just drive on. These guys will deal with it themselves. But it's also because, and I'm sure that's, I don't know how much you grew up in England, because I'm given to assume you were mostly in India, and I mean you grew up in Australia.
Yeah.
But part of I think the psychosocial substrate of Indian people is the meaning they get from community, and it does not matter what that community is. It really does not. Near a fire, there's 5 people going to sit around that fire and start talking shit as if they knew each other forever. They'd start talking about Modi, and suddenly Modi to Bhagwan hai. That kind of shit would show up in a second and a half, and it's because we are people's people. Like Dilwalo Ki Dilli is not very far from what is accurate. I don't care what I do. You guys are chasing something very, very meaningful. Most people, their meaning is within the community itself. And I feel that's partly, or at least a sympathetic view on what explains this entire phenomena of being fascinated with people. I'm curious, how would you say, what's the strangest place you've been to? Or what's the strangest place do you plan on being? What's the craziest adventure you imagine when you think of your future with this project?
We're going to have different responses to this. So
you have different versions of crazy?
We have different.
I know what you're...
Yeah. Go on.
I'm really looking forward to, I think, two places that I have just no reference frame for. Is we've got a bunch of Sindhis who are waiting to be interviewed in Chhattisgarh, and I'm just like, what are they doing there?
Right,
How did they end up there?
What the fuck? Whoa, where in Chhattisgarh?
So one of our volunteers, Diksha.
Yeah.
She
Shout
lives
out.
in shout out to Diksha Tiwari. She is from Chhattisgarh, and she got in touch with us the first time we met. She got in touch saying I have all these connections to the Sindhi community of Chhattisgarh who all came over in partition, and we were just like, what?
How far did you walk, bro?
I get how you ended up in Jaisalmer, right?
Yeah.
I'm coming from Sindh. I get how you end up in Amritsar.
You're gonna find Forrest Gump there. You know? He's been walking since, man.
It's like, I'm gonna stop now.
Yeah. I have finally arrived. Have you heard of that myth about Jesus coming all the way to Kashmir before he died?
Yeah.
It's the same kind of story,
It's
man.
the same kind of like that where you're talking about like post-colonial trauma and trying
Right.
to approximate trying to approximate and like not find pride in your own identity. Like there's no historical proof for Jesus ever coming to Kashmir, is there?
Is that no historical?
There's some stuff. I mean, you know, people like to mythologize about that
Yeah.
stuff. Have you seen The Last Man on Earth? And
I think I've watched a bunch of these style of documentaries.
Yeah,
You know,
yeah.
like
But-
I don't know.
It gets too
I think you
Illuminati
guys
for
are gonna
me.
fall out.
No, but tell me.
I'm not. No, so there's
The Sindhis in Chhattisgarh.
Sindhis in Chhattisgarh, and then also like I'm just interested of like what we're gonna find in Bangladesh. Like I don't have that much of a handle on the like what kind of stories, because we've not broken into that area yet. We've done a lot of West Bengal stories to then track in Bangladesh, but we haven't got I'm just interested what kind of narrative we're going to hear when we get there.
It's also a double partition, you know.
Yeah.
There is more to it than just
Exactly.
almost unmentioned in the. Nobody ever speaks of Bangladesh, you know. Like colloquially speaking, it's just it exists kind of a thing. So I'm sure there's some stuff that you'd pull out from there that's absolutely necessary, novel, and
Yeah, and one of the most nuts areas of partition violence in 47 and the years afterwards was like the Bihari Muslims who fled to Bangladesh, and there was a huge amount of. But then often, you know, you get these crazy stories of like, you know, I remember there was a woman who fled Bihar, went to Bangladesh, then in 71 fled to Pakistan, and then she became a kind of a Sufi Kalandar at the shrine of Lal Bala Sharif. She passed away, she was called the Lal Peri, and she passed away about 2 years ago or something. But little stories like that, which I'm always just like, you know, it's so much more complex when you get into the Bangladeshi identity of the double partition.
Right. What's your version of crazy, bro?
I just cannot wait to see my grandfather's village again. You know, that's gonna be.
Which one is that?
This is near Attock in Pakistan. There's a small town called Bela, and then I also want to go to Dera Ghazi Khan because like so my maternal grandfather has very much like opened up about partition like since like he was the first story we covered as a project. We've had a lot of time to like, you know.
He's the other face of the project.
Yeah, he's the other face of the
With
project. To like delve into his story.
Right.
So he came from a place called Bela, which is a small pind. It's near Attock. But the second thing that like my paternal grandfather was always been a little bit more hesitant to talk about it. He like migrated in a little bit more difficult circumstances, kind of hiding under dead bodies on the trains to get to Delhi. He came from a place called Dera Ghazi Khan, which is also in West Punjab. It's more like central Punjab. And so my last name is Ahuja. We got a message on Instagram or Facebook by another guy from the same place as me in Delhi, Tilak Nagar, whose last name was also Ahuja, who says my grandfather's also from Dera Ghazi Khan. And then I suddenly started researching more and more, and there's a whole community of Ahujas that migrated from Dera Ghazi Khan to come to Tilak Nagar in Delhi, and that's something I really want to cover because it's just about like my own personal heritage.
Pretty dope.
That's another thing that actually has opened my eyes in terms of like through the project, something I've learned that I didn't expect to.
Right.
Has been, you know, the areas within just this city where like, you know, this whole area was just refugees from this very specific area, and so you know there's this whole Multani community that's here. There's the whole Dera Ghazi Khan community that's in Tilak Nagar, and you know these very specific
Air bubbles that
have floated in their entirety without bursting.
This entire communities in Karachi, which are Kerala.
So Kerala has the oldest Muslim population in South Asia. You know, they have the oldest mosque that dates from, you know, one generation after the Prophet. I think it is. Like
that's quite interesting. How'd that travel there?
So
bloody hell!
Boats.
Damn, man.
They just came over.
No, I have heard Kerala has some like there is a lot of oral traditions that operate in Kerala as well that we sort of
the
have.
oldest Christians. So there's like at the Council of Nicaea or something where they decided one of the Christian creeds. They had more bishops representing from India than from the entirety of Europe.
Interesting.
Because of the fact that, like, you know, Kerala, again, because of the spice trade, just, there were people coming here the whole time. And so you had Saint Thomas, the disciple of Jesus,
Right.
who arrived within a couple of years of Jesus' death. Within a couple of years of Muhammad's death, you have some of his followers ending up in Kerala again. And it's very early. But there is still they're called the Mopla community, these Muslims in Kerala. There's still a large Mopla community in northern Kerala near Kanu. But a lot of them migrated to Karachi.
Right.
And the Keralan migration is something that you have even if you've heard of like the Tripura migration, you very rarely get to hear about the Keralan migration, and just these little like very specific pockets that have shifted across the chessboard.
Very interesting. Very interesting. Does Project Dastaan fit into a bigger piece for you guys eventually? Is this just like a one-off project because I want this to be out? This is something that I really feel for, or is this working towards a grander idea? Do you want to continue moving in this direction?
I think so, but I'm not too sure, like, based on whether it'll be as a Project Dastaan, but I'm sure that like everyone on the team doesn't see this as like, okay, we only care about this issue and then that's it,
Right.
Like, this is what we want to do with our lives. We want to tell stories and make people like reconsider like their just opinions on things,
right?
And not in a way that's like we're going to tell you what's right and what's wrong. It's like,
here's the story.
Yeah, just let's have a conversation. Listen to this and tell me what you think. And whatever you think is valid, but just listen to this.
We want people to think and consider.
I mean, that's all very romantic, but here's the point. No. I've been thinking about it, and there is a legitimate movement in terms of people with vision are trying to sort of instantiate something like that, and it's worked. It's not like it doesn't, right? We ideally should be having more conversation. It's just that with the whole time span aspect on one end, what's really happening on the mass consumption level is that we are settling for canned pieces, right? And so that's why as soon as you just try to tell a story, which is sort of what I'm doing, the first obstacle I face is exactly that. Tell me the fucking summary so we can walk forward from here. You might be inherently interested in your idea, and so you'll give it the time, but a lot of people are sort of interested in the idea, and so how do you plan on tackling that bit of your project?
So this is the question that like came up again and again and again when we first tried to get funding for it. And it's like people coming up to and says like, hey, that's a nice mosque in Makodi, but like I don't give a shit because I didn't come from there, right?
Right.
So how do you get me to care? And so now we're, in addition to doing these little 360 tours for these witnesses, what we're also doing is we're creating an interactive VR documentary that not only gives the person the chance to like put virtually, imagine in VR you can put a headset on a witness and virtually be part of our team and our journey, but you can actually go through the entire partition as if you're a migrant. And by that we're trying to, it's interactive, so we're trying to contextualize like it's like a first person experience of a migration journey, and we're creating that for museums and film festivals.
What the fuck?
So then they can care.
Why have you not mentioned that?
It's all over our website.
What the fuck? So, and when does this get out? How do I access that?
We're aiming for next August, or this August. It's 2020 now, so we're aiming for this August. So this will either be optimized for like a standalone VR experience at a museum. We're also thinking of developing it for web. Like there's different ideas up in the air.
This is early. The reason we've not brought this up in a bigger way is because of it's much earlier in development.
Right.
We've also got another documentary called The Lost Migration, which is going to be, we're going to physically take someone over the border.
That's directed by this creative producer at Vice called Shabana Farid, and she's in New York.
Right.
And she's come up with this like crazy idea to not just like we're doing it virtually, but she's come up with this like crazy idea to actually take her grandfather back to Lucknow in the current political circumstances, and it'll be if she manages to pull it off, and like.
And you part of that team?
Yeah, we're all working together to make that happen. So she's directing that film. And
so the crowdfunding money will also go into seed funding that. So again, earlier level stage of production, the social impact taking back 75 people is the thing that's actually like the front and center right now. But then once that begins to wrap up, then we've got these other two
pieces that are coming
pieces of
along.
the puzzle.
Right.
And Child of Empire, which is the interactive experience, is directed by a VR director called Irfan Sadati, who's worked on a bunch of like award-winning films for places like Future of Storytelling, and he's worked at featured at Sheffield Doc Fest and places like these. So it's very exciting. We were recently accepted onto this accelerator called dev lab,
Uh-huh.
which is like run out of I think Baltimore,
Uh-huh.
and that incubates like 16 new VR films every year.
Right.
Um,
and you're
and
one of them now?
Yeah, we're one of them. So
Oh,
we're
heck
getting
yeah.
like, that interactive experience is going through like a training program and development.
Right.
Yeah.
I'm only concerned, I haven't really hung out with VRs too much yet. I'm a little slow on technology. Is it not disorienting to watch like anything over 20 minutes on a VR set? Do you not eventually begin to be like, does it not do that?
Yeah, you don't like most VR experiences are made for under 20 minutes,
Uh-huh.
and like your shots have to be stable.
Right.
Like if you're
This is moving
walking
VR has
around
been
is-
an ongoing joke.
Oh my gosh.
Because like,
Yeah.
how do you, if you're putting one of these like tripods with a camera attached on the top of a rickshaw, and imagine the jolts on that.
Oh my gosh.
And it's not like you can use a editing program like with normal footage to kind of stabilize it quite as much because it's 360. So the whole
it
thing
can cause
is,
people to throw up if you don't do it. Like
How's
and
the,
particularly with old people. Like
what the
maybe-
fuck?
Our-
Particularly like with, and this
our
guy's like
audience is,
particularly
like,
with
90.
old
Yeah.
people.
like
Yeah,
you
exactly the
probably-
kind of people we're trying to make cry. We're also trying to make them barf. Yes, that's the idea.
yeah,
That's
Just let it out.
is the editing? You said the editing software is different. Is it how much
it's
are
not,
we?
I mean, 360 video is just it's not like fundamentally different to 2D video.
Uh-huh.
It's like the same thing as an image and a panorama, but for video.
Right.
So editing that you can just do it in the same software like Premiere Pro or Final Cut.
Right.
Like you can do editing.
And is it as efficient to edit it as like? Are we at the same level of development in the VR sector of video?
I mean, 360 video. Yeah, I think there's. Like as I said, you can apply the same tools, so you can edit it exactly the same way. Obviously, like there's limitations in terms of like distribution.
Uh-huh.
So not everyone has a headset.
Right.
So like, of course, you can like watch it on a web experience and use your mouse to like browse around.
But it's not that fun.
But it's not the same as like using
No,
like,
it's
a,
not
a
that fun.
cardboard, for instance.
For sure.
So like, but even something like the cheapest thing they have is the Google Cardboard, which is like $1, and you can put your phone into it and have like a quasi VR experience. It's not true VR because it's not interactive, but it's
Right.
360 video.
Right.
This is something that's quite important to the taking map because we can show our experience, and then we can leave it with them because we don't need to afford a 700 quid VR headset because we can just leave them one that costs $1, and as long as you've got a phone, which realistically most people
Do.
these days. Ultimately, this is the big new emerging phone market
Right.
in South Asia.
Right.
And so everyone's got
I've
YouTube.
heard of that. Yeah.
Everyone's got YouTube. You can use YouTube, put it in this little cardboard thing with a bunch of lenses on it, and it just kind of works.
Yeah,
I
does
see.
the job. But
Uh-huh.
like the issue is like for a more general audience that if we put a 360 video out there, they like no one just owns a Google Cardboard.
Right.
It's $1, but no one would go out there and like today I feel like buying a Google Cardboard.
Oh yeah.
Yeah,
Mhm.
but so that's the challenge with like not just
I think museums are a good place to see these kind of stuff.
exactly, yeah.
You know?
So it's not like the industry hasn't come around to like democratizing it yet because there's still this like equipment barrier that like
We
prevents
haven't
the-
broken into yet.
Yeah.
Yeah.
and until
Carrying
that
your
becomes
phones.
normalized, yeah.
It's been normalizing gaming.
Yeah, and actually, to an extent, like corporate training has started.
Corporate training,
yeah.
weirdly. Yeah, gaming, corporate training, and like pornography. It
And
seems to be
pornography.
big three.
For sure. It's crazy what the world's up to with that shit, man. Oh my gosh. I like I said, I've never really used VR headsets, but my roommate recently got like one of those expensive ones, Oculus or something.
Yeah.
Given to him, that's a good one. And I'm just sitting watching my television. He's like, put it on, and I put it on. I'm like, whoa, nope, never take this back, never return here. I'm gonna stop leaving my home because that shit's super real, man. And it's and with what's up with deepfake and whatnot, this shit, the internet porn industry worries me.
Yeah.
Fundamentally worries me.
Deepfakes is another podcast.
Oh
that
my gosh.
shit is crazy.
Oh my gosh, yeah. But thank you so much for being here, you guys. It's been super fun. Let people know where can they find you? What are your Instagrams? What are your websites so people can find
Project
you?
Dastaan, Project Dastaan, and Project Dastaan.
Project Dastaan. I will try and scour your personal Instagrams and put it out there as well. You guys, do you have any questions for me at all? Take a moment.
Yeah, let me think. What did you see on that headset?
No, okay. I'll tell you, man. I was fitter than I was in real life. I was sitting down, my hands were up here, and there was this beautiful ass woman trying to climb towards my cross, and I was like, no.
Okay, right.
Yes. For real, that's the. Oh, what else are you expecting out of pornography? It's not going to be bhajans, man. It's going to be BS.
I mean, or it could be a man in Canberra taking you around a burger, right?
No, but the equipment barrier is real. Like the only I don't want to carry a headset around to like enjoy my life. You know, the phone's
Yeah.
enough of a fucking.
Well, that's
income.
why AR is going to be like also pretty like revolutionizing. You know,
Right.
like, making like holograms that you can just like, hey, like look here, there's Serena Williams. I know like someone is working on that. Just kind of
mad.
yeah, holograms are pretty mad.
So you just like put your phone to a place and a hologram pops up.
No,
and
no,
it
no, no.
speaks
I
to
said
you.
like you can see it through your phone screen.
Right.
Right?
That's exactly what I mean.
Yeah.
Yeah. Mhm.
And
So you
they're
don't need that
interactive
equipment.
as well as you can speak to them, and they're some of them powered by artificial intelligence.
Think
So-
Pokemon Go.
Uh-huh.
You know, the
Right.
little-
Right.
Well, that
Of
was the
course.
first big world scale.
Yeah.
And it really
application
took off.
of AR,
It
yeah.
really took off. Yeah, I wonder if like if I think what this technology needs really is biotechnology. Like the
Yeah.
addition of biotechnology, and the game's over on that one. Then you can seed it right here and just like start
That's
taking
like
hologram.
getting Black Mirror.
Black Mirror kind of
Yeah,
shit for
yeah.
sure. Yeah.
How long do we reckon we have before the robots
I mean,
take it?
Ray Kurzweil says about 15 years before Singularity hits, so I think we have like 7 to 8 on that end.
7 to 8 years.
No. I'm exaggerating it. But Ray Kurzweil's ideas about singularity is about 15 to 20 years down the line. So we would have to hit a biotechnology leap before that, before we get to understanding how to create life itself. I'm sure we understand how biology might operate in that regard. So it's a scary prediction. I took a whole class this semester on stuff like this, and the future's dystopic. I give up. This is all a video game. There's a simulation.
Like the interesting thing is this starts like raising like it's crazy how like this modern technology, especially like this whole XR development is like starting to raise the same questions that like people like Descartes and like even before that in Indian philosophy were like raising like 2000 years ago.
Third
This
century
whole idea
BC.
of like experience machines and like vats and brains and vats and like that was
These
just
are
an
no
idea back
longer
then.
these are no longer like philosophical thought questions.
No,
you know?
right, exactly.
Yeah.
This class was called Reincarnation and Technology. So
Okay.
it sort of puts
Yeah.
the picture. You start off with reading Hindu texts and Buddhist texts, and then you move on to proper philosophy,
Because there's
physics.
the one of that butterfly, the butterfly text.
The butterfly effect.
No, not the butterfly effect. There's a famous text where this was me trying to show off in first year philosophy class.
Uh-huh.
And we were doing like I think our first essay that I got at Oxford was like, how do you know you have hands?
Uh-huh.
Like where have I shown up? Like why did I come from Australia
Right.
to do this? But I was
Right.
like, and
You
this is
establish
like-
the ontology of hands
Yeah.
is that you have 5 fingers, at least space for
Yeah.
5 fingers.
And yeah, instead of like it was meant to refer to Descartes and his whole like dream idea, but I thought like, I'm not gonna show the white man's story, so I found the
Right.
exact same story written by a Chinese philosopher
Ah.
about being a butterfly. But it was the same thing, and my professor was like, "Why don't you just use the reading man? Like, why go all this way to put a quote about a butterfly in the first paragraph?"
It was
But,
once
yeah.
said
Yeah.
Yeah,
by Lao Tzu.
yeah, yeah. It was something along those lines.
All right, man. Thank you
Yeah.
so much. It's been fun.
Just thanks.
Yeah.